In 2023, legendary director Ridley Scott released Napoleon, a sweeping epic starring Joaquin Phoenix as one of history's most fascinating figures. With a budget of over $200 million, stunning battle sequences, and Scott's trademark visual grandeur, the film promised to bring Bonaparte's incredible life to the big screen. But here's the thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. His actual life was so extraordinary, so filled with genuine drama and impossible victories that you really don't need to make stuff up. And yet, Napoleon the film takes some creative liberties with history. A lot of them, actually. Now, I want to be clear up front. This isn't about whether Napoleon is a good movie. That's subjective. This is about the fascinating gulf between what the film shows us and what actually happened. Because when Ridley Scott was confronted about historical inaccuracies, he famously told a historian to get a life. Bold. But history isn't just dry facts in dusty books. These events shaped the modern world, and the real story is often more interesting than the fiction. So today, we're breaking down what Ridley Scott's Napoleon got wrong about Napoleon Bonaparte, the French Revolution, and one of the most consequential periods in European history. Let's get into it. Let's start with one of the most visually striking scenes in the film. Napoleon ordering his troops to fire cannons at the pyramids of Giza. It's a powerful image, right? Napoleon as this iconoclast, this destroyer of ancient wonders, showing his contempt for history itself. There's just one problem. This never happened. Now, Napoleon did lead a campaign to Egypt in 1798, and there was indeed a Battle of the Pyramids, but that battle took place about 6 miles away from the actual pyramids. The monuments weren't involved at all. In fact, Napoleon brought over 150 scientists, mathematicians, and scholars with him to Egypt specifically to study ancient Egyptian culture. This expedition led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and basically founded the field of Egyptology. Napoleon was actually fascinated by ancient civilizations. He would gather his troops near the pyramids and give speeches about how 40 centuries of history looked down upon them. This was a man who admired ancient achievements, not someone who would casually destroy them for tactical advantage. The real Battle of the Pyramids was fought in the desert against Mamluk forces, and it was a decisive French victory. But you know what's weird? That actual battle was pretty cinematically interesting on its own. The Mamluks were elite cavalry warriors, and Napoleon's forces formed squares to defend against their charges. It was a classic example of Napoleonic tactics triumphing against a numerically superior force. So why change it? Presumably for visual impact. But in doing so, the film fundamentally mischaracterizes Napoleon's relationship with history and culture. Early in the film, we see Napoleon witnessing Marie Antoinette's execution by guillotine in October 1793. It's meant to show us the chaos of revolutionary France and Napoleon's rise during the Terror. The problem? Napoleon wasn't in Paris when Marie Antoinette was executed. He was hundreds of miles away in the south of France, participating in the siege of Toulon. This might seem like a minor nitpick, but it actually matters quite a bit. Napoleon's success at Toulon, where he was a young artillery officer, was what first brought him to prominence. He was promoted to brigadier general at age 24 because of his tactical brilliance in that siege. This was the launching pad for his entire career. By placing him in Paris instead, the film strips away the context of how Napoleon actually rose through the ranks. He didn't advance because he was in the right place at the right time in Paris. He advanced because he was an exceptional military tactician who won battles. The execution of Marie Antoinette was certainly a pivotal moment in the revolution, but Napoleon's connection to it was distant and political, not personal. He was a provincial officer, proving himself in combat, not a Parisian spectator to royal executions. The film dedicates enormous screen time to Napoleon's relationship with Josephine, and this is where things get really complicated. The movie portrays Napoleon as utterly dominated by Josephine, obsessed with her to the point of appearing weak and pathetic. There are scenes of him literally barking like a dog, crawling under tables, and being emotionally manipulated throughout their relationship. Now, was Napoleon genuinely in love with Josephine? Yes, especially early in their relationship. His letters to her are famous for their passion and intensity. But the dynamic portrayed in the film is wildly exaggerated and doesn't match the historical record. First, their meeting. In the film, they meet at a society party where Josephine is portrayed as a sophisticated seductress. In reality, Josephine was in a financially precarious position after her first husband was executed during the Terror. She was 6 years older than Napoleon and had 2 children. Their marriage was as much a practical arrangement as a romantic one. Second, Napoleon's personality. While he was genuinely passionate about Josephine, historical accounts describe Napoleon as charismatic, commanding, and intensely focused on his work. Yes, he could be emotional, but he was also leading armies, reforming French law, and essentially running an empire. The film's portrayal of him as a simpering, obsessive figure doesn't square with someone who was simultaneously conquering most of Europe. Third, the infidelity. The film focuses heavily on Josephine's affairs and Napoleon's jealous reaction. And yes, Josephine did have affairs while Napoleon was on campaign. But what the film barely touches on is that Napoleon also had numerous affairs and mistresses. This wasn't a one-sided dynamic of betrayal. Finally, the divorce. They divorced in 1810, primarily because Josephine couldn't provide an heir. This was a political decision as much as a personal one. Napoleon needed legitimate children to establish his dynasty. The film portrays this more as the culmination of a toxic relationship, rather than a pragmatic, if painful, political necessity. The real tragedy of the Napoleon-Josephine relationship is actually quite moving, without exaggeration. 2 people who genuinely cared for each other, torn apart by the demands of empire and dynasty. That's compelling drama without making Napoleon literally bark like a dog. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 was Napoleon's greatest victory, and the film includes a dramatic sequence where Napoleon orders his artillery to fire on frozen lakes, breaking the ice and drowning thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers. This is probably the most famous historical controversy about the film. And here's the truth: this didn't really happen, at least not on the scale depicted. First, the scale. The film shows thousands of soldiers falling through ice and drowning. In reality, historical sources suggest that maybe a few dozen men, some horses, and several cannons went through the ice on a frozen pond. Contemporary accounts barely mention it. Second, the tactic. The film portrays this as a brilliant strategic masterstroke by Napoleon. But actually, if it happened at all, it was more of an incidental occurrence during the chaos of retreat. It wasn't a planned tactic that won the battle. Third, what actually won Austerlitz? Napoleon's real genius at Austerlitz was in deception and positioning. He deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the Allies into overextending themselves, then struck at their exposed center with his reserves. It was a masterclass in tactical misdirection and timing. The battle was won through superior generalship, not through a theatrical ice-drowning spectacle. When historians pointed out this inaccuracy, Ridley Scott responded, "When I have issues with historians, I ask, 'Excuse me, mate, were you there? No? Well, shut up then.'" Which is certainly a take. By that logic, we can't say anything about any historical event unless we personally witnessed it. The frustrating thing is that the real Battle of Austerlitz is absolutely fascinating. Napoleon's son of Austerlitz broke through the fog at the perfect moment. His troops executed complex maneuvers with precision, and he defeated a numerically superior force through sheer tactical brilliance. That's inherently cinematic. The film depicts Napoleon's disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia, but it compresses and simplifies what was actually an incredibly complex campaign. First, the timeline. The movie makes it seem like Napoleon marched to Moscow, found it burning, and immediately had to retreat. In reality, the campaign lasted from June to December 1812. Napoleon entered Moscow in September and stayed there for over a month, waiting for a peace offer from Tsar Alexander that never came. Second, the numbers. The film doesn't convey the sheer scale of this disaster. Napoleon invaded with about 685,000 men from the Grande Armée. Fewer than 100,000 made it back. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. Third, the reasons for failure. The film attributes the failure mainly to winter and snow. And yes, the winter was brutal, but the campaign was already in serious trouble before winter hit. Russian forces employed a scorched earth strategy, destroying supplies and infrastructure as they retreated. Disease and desertion depleted French forces throughout the summer and fall. Napoleon's supply lines were catastrophically overextended. Fourth, the retreat. The film shows some suffering during the retreat, but it doesn't capture the true horror. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Cossacks harassed the retreating columns constantly. Discipline broke down completely. Men resorted to cannibalism. The crossing of the Berezina River alone cost tens of thousands of lives. The Russian campaign was the beginning of the end for Napoleon, and it deserves more nuanced treatment than he went to Russia. It was cold. He lost. Waterloo, Napoleon's final battle, is given significant screen time in the film, but the actual battle is portrayed quite differently from how it unfolded. First, the mud. The film doesn't adequately convey that the battlefield was a muddy swamp from recent rains, which severely hampered both cavalry and artillery. This wasn't just flavor, it was tactically decisive. Napoleon delayed his attack to let the ground dry, which gave the Prussians time to arrive. Second, the Prussian role. Speaking of Prussians, the film understates their crucial contribution. The popular imagination often focuses on Wellington's defense, but Blucher's Prussian army arriving on the battlefield was absolutely essential to Napoleon's defeat. It was a two-army effort. Third, the Imperial Guard. The film shows the famous attack by Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard, but the complexity of this final gamble is simplified. These were Napoleon's best troops, veterans of countless campaigns, and their failure marked the definitive end of his military mystique. When the Imperial Guard retreated, the cry went up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. This had never happened before. Fourth, Napoleon's command. At Waterloo, Napoleon wasn't at his sharpest. He may have been ill, possibly with hemorrhoids, which sounds funny but would have been agonizing. His decisions were less inspired than in his earlier campaigns. The film portrays him as defiant and bold, but historical accounts suggest he was somewhat diminished. Fifth, the aftermath. The film rushes through what happened after Waterloo. Napoleon didn't immediately surrender. He abdicated again, fled to the coast, and considered escaping to America before ultimately surrendering to the British. Beyond specific events, the film's portrayal of Napoleon's personality and character deserves examination. The Napoleon of the film is brooding, socially awkward, and often appears incompetent in non-military settings. Joaquin Phoenix plays him as withdrawn and strange, but historical accounts paint a very different picture. Napoleon was actually known for his charisma and personal magnetism. He could be charming and engaging in conversation. He had a prodigious memory and could recall the names and details of soldiers he'd met once, years earlier. He worked at an absolutely punishing pace, sometimes dictating to multiple secretaries simultaneously on different topics. Yes, he could be temperamental and had a famous temper, but he was also witty, curious, and intellectually voracious. He reorganized French law with the Napoleonic Code, which still influences legal systems worldwide. He modernized administrative systems, promoted education, and patronized the arts and sciences. The film also doesn't really convey Napoleon's military genius. We see him winning battles, but we don't understand why. Napoleon revolutionized warfare with his use of corps system. His emphasis on mobility and speed, his integration of artillery, and his mastery of logistics. He won through innovation and intelligence, not just through aggression. Furthermore, the film's portrayal of Napoleon as sexually submissive and weak-willed with Josephine contrasts sharply with someone who crowned himself emperor and conquered most of Europe. This isn't to say he wasn't complex or didn't have vulnerabilities, but the film's characterization often feels inconsistent with his achievements. Beyond inaccuracies, there are significant omissions in Napoleon's story that would have enriched the film. First, Spain. The Peninsular War in Spain was a running sore that drained French resources and gave Britain a foothold on the continent. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer. It's barely mentioned in the film. Second, Napoleon's reforms. The Napoleonic Code, the administrative reorganization of France, the establishment of the Bank of France, the concordat with the Catholic Church. These were enormous achievements that shaped modern Europe. The film focuses almost entirely on military campaigns and romance. Third, the 100 Days. Napoleon's escape from Elba and return to power for a final 100 days is one of history's most dramatic comebacks. The film rushes through it in minutes. Fourth, his family. Napoleon placed his siblings on thrones across Europe. This nepotistic empire building was crucial to his system and its eventual failure. The film ignores it almost entirely. Fifth, his death. Napoleon died in 1821 on St. Helena, possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from poisoning. Historians debate this. His final years in exile were filled with memoir writing and bitter reflection. The film gives us a brief caption. So what's the verdict on Ridley Scott's Napoleon? As a film, it's visually impressive with strong performances. As history, it's deeply flawed, mixing genuine events with fabrications, oversimplifications, and odd characterization choices. The frustrating part isn't that a historical film takes liberties. That's inevitable when compressing decades into hours. The frustrating part is that Napoleon's real story is so inherently dramatic that many of these changes feel unnecessary. Napoleon Bonaparte was a Corsican outsider who rose from artillery officer to emperor. He won impossible victories through tactical genius. He reformed legal systems still used today. He conquered most of Europe before his ambition destroyed him. He escaped exile once and nearly did it again. His life reads like an adventure novel, except it actually happened. You don't need to make him shoot at pyramids. You don't need to make him pathetic in his personal life to humanize him. The real contradictions of Napoleon, military genius and strategic blunderer, Enlightenment reformer and autocratic dictator, romantic and pragmatist, are fascinating enough. Ridley Scott told historians to get a life when they criticized his historical accuracy. But history isn't just academic pedantry. These events shaped the world we live in today. Understanding what actually happened and why gives us insight into human nature, leadership, warfare, and politics. So yes, Napoleon is a movie, not a documentary. But when the real story is this compelling, why change it? If you enjoyed this deep dive into what Napoleon got wrong, let me know in the comments what historical film you'd like me to tackle next. And if you learned something new, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.